They say war changes a man, makes him see things, hear things. But what I experienced in the autumn of 1917 wasn't just the shell shock talking. This is my story, as I lived it, in those terrible months somewhere in the forests of northern France. My name is James Mitchell. I was 23 years old when I enlisted, young, eager, foolish. By the time October came around, I'd already spent 8 months in the trenches. I'd seen friends disappear into the mud, watched good men lose their minds to the constant bombardment. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what happened during that last week of October. It started on a Tuesday evening. The guns had finally gone quiet after 3 days of relentless shelling. That silence, it was almost worse than the noise. Your ears would ring, searching for sounds that weren't there anymore. I was on watch duty with my unit, stationed in a forward trench. The area between our line and the enemy position, we called it no man's land, stretched out about 200 yards. Nothing but craters, broken wire, and the remains of failed advances. Nobody went out there unless ordered, and nobody came back the same. Around midnight, I heard it for the first time, a voice, clear as day, cutting through the darkness. Someone calling out, in perfect English, "Hello? Is anyone there? I need help. Please, I'm hurt." I grabbed my rifle, every muscle tensing. Corporal Davies, the man next to me, heard it too. I could see it in his eyes, that mix of duty and dread. "Could be a trap," Davies whispered. "The enemy's used tricks before." But the voice came again, weaker this time. "Please, I can't move my legs. It's so cold out here." The accent was American, one of ours, maybe separated from a unit further down the line. It happened sometimes in the chaos of battle. Men got lost, wounded, left behind. I looked at Davies. Protocol said we report it, wait for orders. But that voice, there was something in it, raw pain, genuine fear, the kind you can't fake. "We should tell Lieutenant Foster," Davies said. But he didn't move. We both knew Foster was dealing with his own demons lately. The man barely slept, jumped at shadows. 3 more hours passed. The voice kept calling out, sometimes strong, sometimes fading to almost nothing. Always the same message. "Please help me. I'm hurt. So cold." As dawn approached, I made a decision that would haunt me for months to come. I grabbed my field glasses and carefully raised my head above the trench line to scan no man's land. The morning mist was thick, rolling across the broken ground like a gray ocean. I searched every crater, every shell hole within sight. Nothing. No movement, no sign of anyone out there. But the voice continued, clear and close. "Is anyone listening? Please. I don't want to be alone." That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The voice wasn't coming from out in no man's land at all. It was coming from behind me, from deeper within our own trench system. I turned slowly, my hands shaking on the rifle. Davies had heard it too now, his face pale in the growing light. "Mitchell," he breathed, "that's impossible. There's nobody back there. That section's been empty since the gas attack last month." He was right. That part of the trench had been abandoned, deemed too damaged and too close to a suspected enemy listening post. Nobody had been stationed there in weeks. Yet the voice persisted, somehow both distant and intimate, like someone whispering directly into your ear from miles away. "Don't leave me here, please. I'm so afraid of the dark." I wish I could tell you we investigated right then, that we were brave soldiers who marched into that abandoned section to solve the mystery. But we didn't. We stood there, frozen, as the sun came up, and the voice finally, mercifully, went silent. That was just the first night. By the end of the week, 12 other men in our unit had heard the voice. Some claimed it spoke different words to each of them, personal things, names of loved ones,
Addresses from back home, information it shouldn't have known. Lieutenant Foster ordered the abandoned section sealed off, but the voice didn't stop. It moved through the trenches like water, finding new places to echo from, always asking for help, always afraid of the dark. 3 men deserted. 2 more had to be sedated after trying to climb over the top to find the source. The official report called it mass hysteria, battle fatigue affecting multiple soldiers simultaneously. But I know what I heard. We all do. The voice became part of our daily routine, like the rats, like the mud, like the constant fear. You learn to live with it. But on the 8th night, everything changed. November had arrived with heavy fog that rolled in thick as wool. Visibility dropped to maybe 10 feet. Command ordered double watches. Fog meant raids, and raids meant casualties. I was paired with a new recruit, Private Tommy Chen from San Francisco. Kid couldn't have been older than 19. Still had that look in his eyes like war was going to be an adventure. "You hear the stories about this section?" Tommy asked, trying to sound casual but failing. "Don't pay attention to stories," I told him. "Keep your eyes forward and your rifle ready." Around 2 in the morning, the fog grew impossibly thick. I couldn't see Tommy anymore, even though he stood just 3 feet away. That's when I heard his voice, tight with fear. "Mitchell, do you see them?" "See what?" "The people. Out in the fog. They're just standing there." My heart started pounding. I strained my eyes into the gray wall surrounding us. At first, nothing. Then, slowly, I began to make out shapes. Figures. Dozens of them, standing motionless in no man's land. "They're enemy soldiers," I whispered. "Has to be. Get ready to sound the alarm." But something wasn't right. They weren't moving, weren't taking positions. Just standing there in the open, completely still. I raised my rifle, sighted on the nearest figure. Through the scope, I could barely make out details through the fog. A uniform. American uniform. The man was facing our trench, arms at his sides. "They're ours," Tommy breathed. "But what are they doing out there?" I shifted my scope to another figure. Another American uniform. Then another. All of them just standing in the killing zone, staring toward our position. "This doesn't make sense," I said. "There's no patrol scheduled. No advance ordered." That's when Tommy screamed. I spun around to see him backing away from the trench wall, his rifle clattering to the ground. He was staring at something behind me, his face twisted in absolute terror. I turned, slowly. One of the figures was now standing in our trench, right there, 10 feet away. I hadn't heard him climb in, hadn't heard any movement at all. The soldier stood perfectly still, face obscured by shadow despite the lantern light. His uniform was caked in mud, torn in several places. He didn't breathe, didn't blink, just stood there like a statue. "Identify yourself," I managed to say, though my voice shook. No response. "I said identify yourself, soldier." The figure's head tilted slightly, like it was studying us. Then, in a voice that sounded like wind through broken windows, it spoke. "Why did you leave us out there?" Tommy bolted, just turned and ran down the trench, screaming for the sergeant. I kept my rifle trained on the figure, finger on the trigger. "Who are you? What unit?" "We called for help," the voice continued, emotionless and hollow. "You heard us. All of you heard us. But nobody came." The fog seemed to pulse around the figure, growing darker. I could see more shapes now, climbing silently into our trench from both directions. All of them wearing American uniforms. All of them moving with that same unnatural stillness. "We waited," another voice said from my left. "We waited in the mud and the cold and the dark. We called out until our voices gave out.
until we couldn't call anymore. My mind raced. No Man's Land had been the site of a failed advance back in April, before my unit arrived. 70 men had gone over the top in a dawn raid. Only 12 came back. The rest? They'd been left out there. Recovery was deemed too dangerous. The bodies stayed where they fell. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though I didn't know why. "I wasn't here. I didn't—" "But you heard us," the first figure interrupted. "You heard us calling, and you did nothing." Shouts erupted from down the trench. Gunfire, men screaming. The fog was alive with those silent figures now, moving through our position like smoke. I don't remember much after that. They say I was found 3 hours later, sitting in a crater out in no man's land, completely unresponsive. Took 2 men to carry me back. When I finally came to in the medical tent, the doctor told me I'd been experiencing severe shell shock, hallucinations brought on by stress and lack of sleep. He gave me sedatives and 3 days rest. But I know what I saw. So did Tommy Chen. So did the 9 other men who were on watch that night. The official report called it mass psychosis, triggered by combat fatigue and environmental conditions. They rotated our entire company out the next week, sent us 20 miles south to a quieter sector. But here's what the report didn't mention. When they finally cleared that section of trench after we left, they found something strange. Muddy footprints leading in from no man's land, dozens of them, all wearing American boots, all ending abruptly in the middle of the trench, like whoever made them simply vanished. And in the abandoned section where it all started, they found a pile of dog tags, 73 of them, each one belonging to a man who'd been lost in that failed April advance. They transferred me to a hospital facility about 60 miles behind the lines. Clean beds, hot food, actual walls instead of mud and sandbags. It should have felt like paradise after months in the trenches. But I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those figures standing in the fog. Every time I started to drift off, I heard that hollow voice asking why we left them out there. The doctors called it acute stress reaction, said my mind needed time to process what I'd been through. They gave me pills that made everything feel distant and fuzzy, like I was living underwater. Tommy Chen was there too, in a bed 3 rows down. He wouldn't talk to anyone, just stared at the ceiling, occasionally whispering things nobody could understand. His family back in San Francisco had been notified he was receiving treatment for battle fatigue. 2 weeks passed. The medication started working, or maybe I just got better at pretending. The review board cleared me for light duty, administrative work, helping process supply requisitions. Nothing that involved going back to the front lines. That's when I met Captain Robert Hargrove. He showed up at the hospital on a rainy Thursday afternoon, asking specifically for me. Hargrove was older than most officers I'd met, probably close to 40. He had the look of someone who'd been in the service long before the war started. "Private Mitchell," he said, pulling up a chair beside my bed. "I've read the reports from your unit about the incident in the trenches." I tensed up. "Sir, the doctor said it was combat fatigue, mass hallucination. We were exhausted and—" "I'm not here to question your sanity, son," Hargrove interrupted gently. "I'm here because you're the 7th person I've interviewed who experienced something similar." That got my attention. Hargrove pulled out a worn notebook, flipping through pages covered in tight handwriting. October 1916. A British unit near the Somme reported voices calling from abandoned positions. March 1917. French soldiers witnessed figures in outdated uniforms moving through their lines during heavy fog. May 1917. A Canadian company recorded multiple sightings of men who couldn't be accounted for. He looked up at me. "And now your unit in November.
all in different sectors, all involving areas where significant casualties occurred, all dismissed as psychological episodes. What are you saying, sir? I'm saying the Army has a problem it doesn't know how to handle, something that doesn't fit into any manual or training protocol. He leaned forward. I need you to tell me everything you remember, every detail, not the sanitized version you gave the doctors. So I did. I told him about the voice that moved through the trenches, about the figures in the fog, about waking up in no man's land with no memory of how I got there. I told him about the dog tags they found. Hargrove listened without interrupting, taking notes the entire time. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Private Mitchell, what I'm about to tell you is strictly confidential. This conversation doesn't leave this room. He paused, choosing his words carefully. The military has documented over 40 similar incidents across the Western Front in the past 18 months, all sharing common elements, all occurring in areas with high casualty rates and incomplete recoveries. Incomplete recoveries? Bodies left in no man's land, men buried in collapsed trenches, soldiers who simply disappeared during advances and were never accounted for. He closed his notebook. The official position is that these are psychological manifestations of collective trauma, groups of men under extreme stress experiencing shared hallucinations. But you don't believe that. I don't know what I believe anymore, Hargrove admitted. But I know that something is happening out there, something that affects real soldiers in real ways. Men are deserting. Others are refusing orders.
3 companies have been completely withdrawn from the front because of these incidents. He stood up, adjusting his cap. I'm assembling a team to investigate these occurrences. Document them properly. Try to understand what's actually happening. I need men who've experienced it firsthand. Men who can face it again without breaking. You want me to go back? Not to the front lines. To the sites where these events occurred, during quiet periods with proper support. We need to understand this before it becomes a larger problem. I should have said no. Should have told him I'd had enough of war and ghosts and things that couldn't be explained. But something in me needed to know, needed to understand what I'd seen that night in the fog. I'll do it, I said. Captain Hargrove's team consisted of 6 men. Besides myself, there was Tommy Chen, who had insisted on volunteering despite still having nightmares. A British sergeant named William Price, who'd experienced something similar near Ypres. A French corporal named Jean Moreau, who'd lost his entire squad to what the reports called mass panic episode. And 2 regular soldiers, Davis and O'Brien, who served as our support crew. Hargrove explained our mission during a briefing in a farmhouse that had been converted into a temporary headquarters. Maps covered every wall, each one marked with red circles indicating locations of reported incidents. Gentlemen, we're not here to fight. We're here to observe and document, Hargrove began. Each of you has witnessed something the Army can't explain. Your job is to help me understand if there's a pattern, a common factor we're missing. He pointed to the map. We'll start with your sector, Mitchell. The trench system where your unit was stationed has been mostly abandoned now. The front line shifted south after a successful advance last week. That gives us relatively safe access to the area. Tommy raised his hand hesitantly. Sir, what exactly are we looking for? Evidence, Hargrove replied. Physical evidence. Something beyond testimonies and reports. If these are just hallucinations, we'll find nothing. But if there's something more, he trailed off, leaving the thought unfinished. We deployed the next morning, traveling by truck to within 2 miles of the old front line. The landscape was devastated, trees reduced to splintered stumps, ground churned into a moonscape of craters and mud. Hard to believe people had actually fought over this God-forsaken earth. The trenches were exactly as I remembered them, waterlogged, collapsed in places, strewn with abandoned equipment and debris. Except now they were silent. No artillery,
No rifle fire, just the wind whistling through broken sandbags. "This is where you heard the voice the first time?" Hargrove asked as we stood in my old position. "Yes, sir. It seemed to come from the abandoned section." I pointed south along the trench line. "About 60 yards that direction." We moved carefully through the trenches. Davis and O'Brien went first, checking for unexploded ordnance and structural collapses. The place felt different in daylight without the constant threat of enemy fire. Less immediately terrifying, but somehow more deeply unsettling. The abandoned section was worse than I remembered. The walls had partially collapsed, leaving gaps that opened into the earth like wounds. Standing water filled the bottom, dark and oily. And the smell. "Gas residue," Sergeant Price observed, wrinkling his nose. "This area took a direct hit during the attack last spring." Hargrove knelt beside a gap in the trench wall, examining something in the mud. He pulled out a small brush and carefully cleaned away the dirt, revealing what looked like fabric, part of a uniform. "There's something here," he said quietly. "Help me excavate this carefully." It took us 20 minutes to uncover what he'd found. It was a body, or what remained of one.
The uniform identified him as American, but exposure and decay made further identification impossible without the dog tags we found clutched in his hand. "Private Marcus Webb," Hargrove read from the tags. According to records, he was listed as missing after the April advance. His body was never recovered. "There could be more," Moreau said, his French accent thick with tension. "If the trenches collapsed during the gas attack, some of the missing men might be buried here." We spent the rest of that day carefully searching the abandoned section. By evening, we'd located 7 more bodies. All American. All from the April advance. All buried in collapsed sections of the trench that had never been properly cleared. As the sun began to set, Hargrove made a decision. "We stay tonight. If the phenomena is real, if it's connected to these unrecovered remains, we need to document it properly." Tommy looked pale. "Sir, are you sure that's wise?" "No," Hargrove admitted, "but it's necessary." We set up position in the main trench, establishing a command post with our equipment. Hargrove had brought recording devices, primitive by later standards, but state-of-the-art for 1917. Wax cylinder recorders that could capture sound, cameras with flash powder for photographs, temperature gauges, even a device for measuring electromagnetic disturbances, though I didn't understand how it worked. Night fell quickly. The temperature dropped. Fog began rolling in from no man's land. "Here we go," Price muttered, gripping his rifle tighter. At exactly midnight, it started. The voice. "Hello? Is anyone there?" But this time we were ready. Hargrove immediately activated the recording equipment. The temperature gauge showed a sudden drop of 15 degrees. The electromagnetic device began fluctuating wildly. "I need help, please. I'm hurt." The voice was coming from the abandoned section, the same place where we'd found Private Webb's body. Hargrove signaled for us to move forward. We advanced carefully, cameras ready, following the sound. The fog grew thicker with each step, just like it had that night weeks ago. And then we saw them. The figures, standing in the trench ahead of us, silent, motionless. But this time, instead of running, we documented everything. The flash from O'Brien's camera lit up the trench like lightning. For one frozen moment, the figures were illuminated in stark detail. Muddy uniforms, pale faces, eyes that didn't quite focus on anything. Then darkness returned, and they were gone. "Did you get the photograph?" Hargrove asked urgently. "Yes, sir," O'Brien replied, his hands shaking as he reloaded the camera.
but I don't know if anything will show up on the plate. The recording device was still running. We could hear our own breathing on it, the shuffle of boots in mud. And underneath it all, that voice, captured on wax. Why did you leave us? Tommy had his notepad out, documenting everything with the precision of someone trying to stay focused through fear. Temperature drop recorded. Visual manifestations confirmed by all 6 witnesses. Time, 12:07 a.m. Sergeant Price moved forward cautiously, reaching out toward where one of the figures had stood. His hand passed through empty air, but his expression changed. It's cold here, like touching ice water, but there's nothing visible anymore. They appeared when we got close to where Private Webb was buried, I observed. Maybe proximity matters. Maybe they're somehow tied to the location of the remains. Hargrove considered this. We found 7 bodies today. According to casualty reports, there should be at least 20 more still unaccounted for in this sector. He looked at the collapsed sections of trench we hadn't fully excavated. What if they're all down there? What if every one of these incidents occurs where men are still buried? The implication hung heavy in the cold air. Across hundreds of miles of front lines, in countless sectors where advances had failed and retreats had been chaotic, there could be thousands of unrecovered soldiers. And if what we were experiencing was real, we need to excavate further, Moreau said quietly. Document the locations of all the remains. See if the pattern holds. We worked through the night, not because we were ordered to, but because something drove us forward. Maybe it was duty. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe we just needed to understand. By dawn, we'd located 11 more burial sites. Some were obvious, collapsed dugouts where the ceiling had caved in. Others were harder to find, bodies buried under layers of mud from shell impacts. Each time we found remains, Hargrove carefully documented the location on his map and recorded the identification details when possible. The phenomena continued throughout the night. Voices calling out, figures appearing in the fog. But now that we were documenting everything, looking for patterns instead of running in fear, we began to notice details. The figures only appeared near unrecovered remains. They never moved more than 20 feet from where bodies were buried. And they always asked the same questions. Why did you leave us? When are you coming back? Don't you hear us calling? As the sun rose, the manifestations faded. The temperature normalized. The fog lifted. We were left standing in muddy trenches surrounded by marked burial sites and scientific equipment. "Gentlemen," Hargrove said, exhaustion evident in his voice, "I believe we have our answer, or at least the beginning of one." He gathered us around his makeshift command post. Every incident reported across the front has occurred in areas with significant unrecovered casualties. The British reports near the Somme. That sector saw 20,000 casualties in a single day. The French incidents, sites of failed offensives with incomplete body recovery. Your experience, Mitchell, directly above where we found Private Webb and his squad. "So what are we saying?" Davis asked. "That the dead are trying to communicate? That they're haunted?" "I'm saying there's a documented correlation between unrecovered remains and these phenomena," Hargrove replied carefully. "Whether that's psychological, survivor's guilt manifesting as shared hallucinations near burial sites, or something else entirely, I don't know. But the pattern is undeniable." Tommy looked up from his notes. "Sir, what do we do with this information? The Army won't accept a report about ghosts."
No, they won't, Hargrove agreed. But they will accept a report about the psychological impact of unrecovered casualties on surviving soldiers. They'll accept recommendations for improved body recovery protocols. They'll accept evidence that failure to properly account for the dead is affecting combat readiness. He began packing up the equipment. We document this properly. We frame it in terms the military can act on. And maybe, just maybe, we prevent other soldiers from experiencing what you all went through. Over the next 3 months, our team investigated 7 more sites across the Western Front. Each investigation followed the same pattern. We'd identify a location where incidents had been reported. We'd research the casualty records. We'd excavate for unrecovered remains. And inevitably, we'd find them. The site near Ypres, where Sergeant Price had his experience, yielded 19 bodies buried in a collapsed tunnel system. A French position, where an entire company had reported hearing voices, contained the remains of 32 soldiers from a failed advance 6 months earlier. Every location told the same story. Men left behind, gradually being forgotten, somehow making their presence known. The phenomena varied in intensity. Some sites showed only minor manifestations, unexplained cold spots, occasional sounds. Others were more dramatic, with visual apparitions and that overwhelming sense of presence we'd experienced. But the pattern held consistent. The more casualties left unrecovered, the stronger the phenomena. Hargrove's documentation grew extensive, detailed maps, hundreds of photographs, though frustratingly, most showed nothing but empty trenches despite all of us witnessing the figures. Temperature records, audio recordings, witness testimonies from over 60 soldiers who'd experienced similar events. The photographic equipment can't capture them, O'Brien finally concluded, after reviewing countless blank plates. But the temperature gauges don't lie. The recordings don't lie. Something is happening in these locations. We presented our findings to a review board in February 1918. Hargrove was brilliant in his approach. He never used terms like supernatural or paranormal. Instead, he focused on the psychological impact. Gentlemen, we have documented evidence that failure to recover fallen soldiers has a measurable negative effect on unit morale and combat effectiveness, he told the board. Soldiers in sectors with high numbers of unrecovered casualties show increased rates of stress disorders, decreased combat performance, and higher desertion rates. He presented chart after chart showing the correlation. He played recordings of the voices, letting the board members hear for themselves the calls for help. He showed photographs of the burial sites we'd excavated, demonstrating how many casualties had simply been left and forgotten. The human mind cannot reconcile abandoning comrades, Hargrove continued. Whether the phenomena soldiers report are genuine manifestations or psychological projections of guilt, the effect is the same. Men cannot fight effectively when they believe their fallen brothers are still out there, still calling for them. The board deliberated for 3 days. Their final decision surprised even Hargrove. They authorized the creation of specialized recovery units, teams dedicated specifically to locating and properly burying unrecovered casualties. They expanded the graves registration service. They implemented new protocols requiring attempts at body recovery even in dangerous circumstances. It wasn't everything Hargrove wanted. They still classified the phenomena as psychological, rather than acknowledging the possibility of something more. But it was action, real, meaningful change. Over the following months, recovery teams worked systematically through the old battlefields. Thousands of soldiers who'd been left behind were finally located, identified, and given proper burials. The incidence of unexplained phenomena decreased dramatically. By summer 1918, the reports had dropped to almost nothing. Our team was officially disbanded. Hargrove returned to regular duties. Price went back to his British unit.
Moreau returned to French command. Tommy Chen and I were reassigned to a supply depot, far from the front lines. The war ended that November. I went home to Pennsylvania, carried my memories with me, and tried to build a normal life. But I never forgot what I experienced in those trenches, what I witnessed, what I documented. The official military records classify the whole investigation as a study on combat fatigue and its effects on perception. The reports mention nothing of voices in the fog or figures in abandoned trenches. They speak only of localized mass psychogenic illness and trauma-induced sensory phenomena. Maybe that's all it was. Maybe Hargrove was right to frame it that way. Maybe our minds created what we needed to see to process the horror of leaving men behind. But I remember those recording devices registering temperature drops when nothing visible was present. I remember voices on wax cylinders asking why we abandoned them. I remember standing in those trenches, surrounded by the presence of men who should have been at rest but somehow weren't. The phenomena stopped when the bodies were recovered. When those soldiers were finally acknowledged, identified, and buried with dignity, that's not psychology. That's not hallucination. That's men who'd been calling out in the dark, finally being heard. I returned to Pennsylvania in December 1918. The war was over. The parades had been held. Everyone wanted to celebrate and move forward, forget the horror, and focus on building the future. But some things don't stay buried, even when you want them to. I got a job at a steel mill outside Pittsburgh. Honest work, physical labor that kept my mind occupied during the day. I rented a small apartment, started attending Sunday services at the local church, and tried to be the man I was before the war. The nightmares came every few weeks. I'd dream about standing in those trenches, hearing voices calling from the darkness. Sometimes I'd wake up, convinced I could still hear them, even thousands of miles from France. The doctors said it would fade with time. They gave me the same pills they'd given me in the hospital. Then in March 1919, I received a letter. The envelope was worn, passed through multiple post offices before finding me. The return address was from Wisconsin. Inside was a single page written in careful handwriting. Private Mitchell, you don't know me, but I believe you knew my son, Private Marcus Webb. The Army notified us that his remains were recovered in November 1917 from a trench system in France. They said a special investigation team found him. I'm writing because I need to know, did he suffer? Was he alone when it happened? My hands trembled holding that letter. Marcus Webb, the first body we'd found, the soldier whose dog tags had been clutched in his hand when we excavated him from the collapsed trench. I spent 3 days trying to write a response. How do you tell a mother what really happened? How do you explain that her son was buried alive in a trench collapse and might have survived for hours or even days before succumbing? How do you tell her about the voice we heard calling from that exact spot? In the end, I wrote what I thought she needed to hear, that Marcus had been found with his unit, that the recovery had been conducted with dignity and respect, that he'd been properly buried in a military cemetery. I didn't mention the investigation, didn't mention the phenomena, didn't mention how her son's voice might have been calling out for months before we finally found him. But that letter opened a floodgate. Over the next 6 months, I received 43 more letters, all from families of soldiers we'd recovered during Hargrove's investigation. Somehow, word had spread that I'd been part of the team. Families desperate for information, for closure, for any detail about what happened to their sons and brothers and husbands. Each letter was harder than the last. Reading about these men's lives before the war, seeing photographs of them in their uniforms, young and proud. knowing what we'd found in those trenches months or years after they'd been lost. One letter came from the sister of Private Daniel Foster, found buried in a dugout near Ypres. She wrote that her brother had been afraid of enclosed spaces his whole life. The thought of him trapped in that collapsed dugout, in the dark, unable to escape, she couldn't bear it. Another came from the wife of Sergeant James Morrison. She'd given birth to their daughter 3 months after he was reported missing. The little girl was now 2 years old and would never know her father. The wife wanted to know if her husband had suffered, if he'd thought of them at the end. I tried to answer them all honestly but kindly. Never mentioned the investigation. Never mentioned the voices or the figures in the fog. Just provided what comfort I could about the recovery and burial.
Then I received a letter that changed everything. It was from Captain Robert Hargrove. Hargrove's letter was brief and direct. "Mitchell, I hope this finds you adjusting well to civilian life. I'm writing because the work we started isn't finished. The military has closed the investigation and considers the matter resolved, but I've continued receiving reports. New incidents, different locations. The war may be over, but the phenomena persists. I'm organizing a private expedition to investigate several sites that were never properly cleared. I need men who understand what we're dealing with. Your country doesn't require your service anymore, but those still calling from the dark might. Consider joining me. We deploy in May." I should have thrown the letter away, should have focused on rebuilding my life, on putting the war behind me. But Hargrove was right. The work wasn't finished. I wrote back, agreeing to join him. In May 1919, I found myself back in France, not as a soldier this time, but as part of a civilian recovery operation. Hargrove had assembled a team of 12 men, all veterans, all who'd experienced the phenomena firsthand. Tommy Chen was there. So was Sergeant Price, now just William Price, ordinary citizen. The French government had given us permission to work in sectors that had been abandoned after the armistice, areas too damaged or too dangerous for immediate reconstruction, places where the dead still outnumbered the living. Our first site was a forest region that had changed hands 4 times during the war. According to records, over 300 soldiers from various armies had gone missing in this sector. Local villagers had reported strange occurrences, voices in the woods at night, figures seen moving between the trees at dusk. The forest was devastated, trees reduced to splinters, ground torn apart by artillery, unexploded shells everywhere, making each step potentially deadly. We worked carefully, using the same methods Hargrove had developed during the war. Systematic grid searches, documentation of every find, respect for every remain we located. We found them everywhere, buried in shell craters, tangled in collapsed bunkers. Some had clearly been there since the early years of the war, slowly being consumed by the forest floor. French soldiers, German soldiers, British soldiers, American soldiers, all left behind in the chaos of battle. And yes, the phenomena was there, stronger than I'd experienced during the investigation. Voices calling out in multiple languages, figures appearing at twilight, that overwhelming presence of something unresolved, something that refused to rest. But now I understood it differently. This wasn't about fear or horror. This was about men who'd been abandoned, forgotten, left to become just another part of the scarred landscape. They weren't trying to hurt us. They were trying to be remembered, to be found, to finally go home. We worked that site for 6 weeks, recovered 217 sets of remains, documented each one carefully, tried to identify them when possible. The French military took custody of the bodies, ensuring proper burial in war cemeteries. By the time we finished,
The phenomena had ceased. The voices went silent. The figures stopped appearing. The forest felt different, still damaged, still scarred, but no longer haunted by presence of the abandoned. We moved to 3 more sites that summer. Each time the same pattern: locate the unrecovered remains, document them, ensure proper burial, watch as the phenomena gradually faded. In September, we received word that Tommy Chen had decided to leave the expedition. The work was taking too heavy a toll on his mental health. He returned to San Francisco, and I heard later that he'd opened a small restaurant, married, started a family. He never spoke publicly about what he'd experienced. The rest of us continued through the autumn. Belgium.
More sectors in France. Even a site in Italy where Alpine troops had been lost in an avalanche and never recovered. Everywhere we went, we found them. And everywhere we went, once they were found and properly honored, the calling stopped. In November 1919, exactly 1 year after the armistice, Hargrove gathered us for a final briefing. We were down to 7 men now. The work had been exhausting, physically, mentally, emotionally. Several team members had returned home, others had found different work. But those of us who remained felt compelled to see it through. "Gentlemen, we have one last site to investigate," Hargrove announced. "It's the place where this all began for me, the location that first made me believe something unexplainable was happening." He showed us a map of a sector near Verdun, one of the most contested areas of the entire war, a place where the earth itself had been torn apart by nearly constant bombardment for months. "In 1916, my original unit was stationed here," Hargrove explained, his voice heavy with memory. "We lost 62 men in a single night when German artillery hit our position. The bombardment was so intense that recovery was impossible. We had to retreat and leave them behind. I've carried that with me ever since." He looked at each of us in turn. "This is personal for me. I need to know if they're still there, if they've been calling out all this time, while I moved on with my duties, my career, my life." We arrived at the site 3 days later. The landscape was otherworldly, nothing but craters and debris as far as you could see. No vegetation, no wildlife, just endless devastation. The French government had declared the entire region a zone rouge, too contaminated and dangerous for human habitation. We established our camp on the edge of the forbidden zone and began systematic searches. The work was harder here. The bombardment had been so intense that bodies weren't just buried, they were scattered, fragmented, mixed with the earth itself. But we found them. Slowly, carefully, we found them. Dog tags corroded by years in mud, scraps of uniform, remains that had to be painstakingly identified through whatever evidence survived. Hargrove worked tirelessly, barely sleeping, driven by something beyond duty. This was about redemption, about finally fulfilling a promise he'd made to men under his command, that they wouldn't be forgotten. On the 5th night, as we worked by lamplight in a crater that had once been a trench system, the phenomena manifested one final time. The temperature dropped suddenly. Fog rolled in despite the clear sky. And we heard them, dozens of voices, all calling out at once in a chorus that raised every hair on my body. But this time it felt different. Not angry, not demanding, almost grateful. Hargrove stood in the center of the crater, surrounded by the marked locations where we'd found his men. Tears streamed down his face as he spoke to the darkness. "I'm sorry it took so long. I'm sorry we left you. But you're found now. You're going home." The voices gradually faded. The fog lifted. The temperature normalized. We spent 2 more weeks at that site, ensuring we'd located and documented every possible remain.
61 sets were recovered, one short of the 62 lost that night in 1916. We never found the last man, though we searched extensively. The French military took custody of all recovered remains. They were buried together in a war cemetery near Verdun, with full honors. A monument was erected, listing all their names. Our work was done. I returned to America in December 1919. 2 years had passed since that first night in the trenches when I heard the voice calling from the darkness. 2 years of investigating the unexplainable, of recovering the forgotten, of witnessing things that defied rational explanation. Captain Hargrove, just Robert now in civilian life, stayed in France. He'd found his calling in the recovery work.
The French government eventually hired him to oversee identification efforts across the former battlefields. He spent the rest of his life ensuring that no soldier remained lost and forgotten. I settled back into my life in Pennsylvania. Got married in 1921 to a woman named Sarah, who'd lost her brother in the war. Had 2 children. Worked at the steel mill for 37 years. To the outside world, I was just another veteran who'd done his duty and moved on. But I never forgot. None of us who'd been part of that investigation ever truly forgot. Over the years, I stayed in contact with the others. William Price became a teacher in London, educating young people about the war and the importance of remembering the fallen. Jean Moreau worked with French veterans organizations, advocating for improved support services. Tommy Chen, despite never speaking publicly about his experiences, donated generously to memorial funds and recovery efforts. We'd seen something that most people couldn't accept or understand. We'd witnessed evidence that the bond between soldiers transcends even death itself. That abandoning those who served alongside you creates a debt that must eventually be paid. The scientific community never acknowledged our findings. The military classified most of our documentation. Hargrove's detailed reports were filed away, marked as psychological studies rather than genuine investigations of unexplained phenomena. The official narrative remained that we'd all experienced collective trauma responses, nothing more. But I know what I heard in those trenches. I know what I saw in the fog. I know that every time we recovered abandoned remains and gave them proper burial, the voices stopped calling. That's not psychology. That's not coincidence. In 1954, I received a final letter from Robert Hargrove. He was in his 70s by then, still working in France, still searching. He wrote that recovery efforts had located over 200,000 previously missing soldiers across the former battlefields. Proper identification and burial had been given to most of them. The reported incidents of unexplained phenomena had virtually disappeared. "We kept our promise, Mitchell," he wrote. "We brought them home." Robert passed away in 1956. He was buried in France, in the same cemetery where many of the men from his original unit had been laid to rest. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, veterans, families of recovered soldiers, French officials, all honoring a man who devoted his life to ensuring the fallen weren't forgotten. I'm an old man now, telling this story in 1963. 46 years have passed since that November night when I first heard the voice calling from no man's land. Most people who hear this account will dismiss it as the memories of an elderly veteran, perhaps confused by time, perhaps still affected by the trauma of war. That's fine. I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. I'm just recording what happened, preserving the memory of what we witnessed and what we accomplished. Because here's what I learned in those trenches, in those investigations, in all those years of recovery work. The living have a duty to the dead, not a religious duty or a legal obligation,
but something more fundamental. Those who fall in service deserve to be remembered, to be honored, to be brought home. Abandoning them, whether through necessity or neglect, creates a wound that doesn't heal. Not for them, not for us. The voices we heard weren't supernatural threats. They were reminders. Calls from men who'd served, who'd sacrificed, who'd been left behind in the chaos and horror of war. They needed to be found. They needed to be acknowledged. They needed to finally rest. And once we fulfilled that duty, once every possible effort had been made to locate and honor them, the callings stopped. I still visit the War Memorial in Pittsburgh every November 11th. I stand there among the names carved in stone, including some of the men we recovered during the investigation. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, when the wind blows just right, I think I can hear echoes of those voices from so long ago. But they're not calling anymore. They're not asking why we left them or when we're coming back. They're silent now, at peace, finally home. That's how I know we did the right thing. That's how I know what we experienced was real. The dead don't haunt us because they're vengeful or malicious. They call out because they've been forgotten. And once remembered, once honored, once properly laid to rest, they can finally let go. We can all finally let go. This is my testimony. This is my truth. Whether you believe it or not, doesn't change what happened in those trenches. It doesn't change the fact that we heard them calling, found them waiting, and brought them home. That's all any soldier can ask for. To be remembered, to be honored, to not be left behind in the dark. We kept that promise.